I would like to introduce our speaker, Dan Mackerman. For over 25 years, Dan worked as a production artist, making sculptures, animations, backdrops, and murals for opera, theater, television, cinema, and department stores. He has a long list of clients, include such names as Disney, Buena Vista, Animal Planet Television, the Minnesota Opera, Prince, Marshall Fields, and Macy's. His work as a production artist occupied 6 months of each year. The other half he spent as a fine artist. To date, Dan has paintings and sculptures in over 70 public institutions. So with that, I'll send it on to you.
So the initial question was, how did my commercial work kind of feed into my fine artwork? And I thought that maybe the way to answer that is kind of like the overarching theme of the talk is first begin with my background that led into the commercial work. And so I thought I'd talk a little bit about that first. And I had a traditional education. I got a master's degree in MFA at the University of Minnesota in painting, drawing, and art history. I had a double major. So, and my big goal at the time was to work in museums, actually, believe it or not. So, and I worked in quite a few museums in the Twin Cities. I worked for the Walker and the Minneapolis Institute of Arts and Minnesota Museum of Art, and worked for a couple of commercial galleries. And some of it was as a what's called a preparator, which is a fancy word for picture hanger. And then other times it was in the education department, teaching classes and stuff like that. And most of the work, this would have been back in the 90s. And most of the work back then, in fact, it was kind of funny how I got every job back then by never applying at all. I would just walk into a place, give them a resume and say, I'm looking for work. And then I'd eventually get a call. There was none of this online stuff. Anyway, but it was usually project-based work. You know, it was not. There were some permanent positions, but mostly it was project-based, and so that was kind of interesting. And then, like at the Walker, I worked as a preparator for a project. It was a pretty huge project. It was like 300 paintings in one exhibition. And anyway, but because it was mostly project-based, you know, eventually I branched out into just straight teaching. And there were quite a few like art centers in the Twin Cities area. There's the Dine Art Center in Bloomington and Minnetonka and White Bear. And so I taught at almost pretty much all of them at one point or another. And at one point, how did it work? This is purely by accident. One of my students was a set builder, and it was a painting class, and he asked me if I've ever painted backdrops before, and I said no. And I hadn't really trained in theater arts at all. And he asked me if I'd be interested in working with him on a project, and I said sure. And it was great. It was a relatively small backdrop. It was only 15 feet wide, and we had to do 4 of them. And it was and here's actually a funny story about it. Is it was a huge event that was meant to celebrate Kurt Carlson's birthday. And Kurt Carlson, for anyone that's not from Minnesota, he's gosh, I'm trying to remember what hotel chain. I think it's Carlton Hotel chain. He was I think I can't remember now. Don't quote me on that. But anyway, that was his claim to fame. And anyway, it was a big success. And this set builder also worked on a yearly installation that was put on, back in those days, it was Dayton Department Store, but Dayton's morphed from Dayton's to Marshall, Fields, and then Macy's. It all was one of the same thing. And anyway, it was a yearly event that this department store held up in its base store downtown Minneapolis in an auditorium. It was a huge auditorium, 13,000 square feet. And every holiday season, they would have this major installation of mechanical figures, just like the Marshall Fields windows downtown Chicago. Only this was a walkthrough, and instead of Marshall Fields, where their scale was pretty small, I think it was like one half scale. This was 3/4 scale, and so filled up the full 13,000 square feet. Anyway, it was a major production. It had a budget of like $500,000, believe it or not, every year, and on average, we got anywhere from 300 to 600,000 people in 2 months. It was unbelievable. And he asked me if I would be interested in working on that project, and I said, sure. And I started out as a set painter and a scenic artist. And in those days, there were like lots of murals to be done, and a lot of trompe l'oeil painting, and backdrop painting. One project came up. I think it was like in the third year. This would have started in like, I think like 92, 91, 92. And one project came up where they needed a sculpture. Each event was devoted to a children's book. Like we would do like Polar Express one year. One year we worked with Tommy DePaula. Roald Dahl. I think you got an illustration of one of our Roald Dahl projects. This one year we were doing Cinderella, and they needed a carriage, pumpkin carriage, and they asked me if I'd sculpt it, and I said sure. And the medium back in those days was styrofoam, and it was kind of cool. It was there was a company in the Twin Cities called Styrotech, and you could buy 8-foot blocks of styrofoam, that 8 foot by 4 foot by 3 feet deep, humongous blocks of styrofoam. And you could glue them together. There's what's called ethofoam, which is the same stuff that you use to spray around your windows for installation. It actually works as a glue for the styrofoam. So you could literally stack a mountain of styrofoam together, which I've done, and make a gigantic sculpture out of it, which I've done. And it was very kind of cutting edge and new back in the early 90s. But to give you an idea of what that was like, if you go to Las Vegas, for example, I don't know if you've ever been to Las Vegas. If you go to Las Vegas, all of the most interesting carving and stuff you see on the outside of buildings, it's all styrofoam. And what they do is even to this day, the styrofoam is used. What they'll do is they'll carve a shape, and then they apply a skin to it that hardens it. And in the old days when it was first being experimented with, we tried everything. We would try like sheetrock mud, joint compound. Some people tried using fiberglass, which was a ghastly. And then there was another type of plastic that people tried spraying on for. But now if you go to like any museum in the country now, or zoo for that matter, and you find some sort of sculpture, like a lot of these fake trees you'll see in the zoos, most likely what they're sculpted out of now is probably a steel armature, and then probably styrofoam on top of that. And then they're finished off with a material that's called polygem, which is basically it's epoxy clay that's water based. So you can actually you can put it on, you can take a wet brush, and brush over it, make it glass smooth, and then it'll dry. And anyway, that's the go-to material these days. But anyway, but back in those days, we were experimenting with everything, and it turns out for me, the tool that was my favorite was a chainsaw. So I would be sculpting these massive epic sculptures with a chainsaw. And of course, you got these beads; they would go everywhere. It was like a complete storm of styrofoam beads everywhere. But so anyway, I got to be known for the sculpture, and everything about my career was one thing would lead to another, and they were always unsolicited work. And when these sculptures got to be seen, then I was getting all this amazing unsolicited work. That's how I got to work with Disney. There was a company in the city that built the booth. Let me back up for a second. Disney, every television studio in the country, or in the world, I'm sorry, every television studio in the world, they all meet once a year in one location. It's called the NATP show, which stands for National Association of Television Program Executives show. And all these studios come to this one place, this one ginormous convention, and all of the crap you see on TV is purchased at this one convention. So they'll, like, one television studio will have like 30 episodes of whatever. I don't watch much TV anymore, so I can't even tell you what the latest is, except for PBS. I watch lots of that. But and so there happened to be in the Twin Cities a company that built what they call the booth for Disney. But when I say booth, what they had was a 15,000 square foot complex that would be installed inside this television convention. I have photographs of all this stuff, but 15,000 square foot complex. It's got screening rooms, it's got stages, it has offices, it has all this stuff. And if you can imagine, that gets installed, it's up for a week, and then it gets torn down. And that's the kind of thing that they would do. And back in those days, their approach to marketing was they would feature their top shows in this space. And my job as an artist was to make these epic, eye-catching sculptures that would cause people to stop and walk into this complex, right? So, and it was a great gig for me. The show always happened in January. So there was nothing better for me, being someone stuck in Minnesota in January, to have to get on a plane and fly to someplace like Miami or Las Vegas or New Orleans. That was my favorite, and work there for a couple of weeks. And that's what we do. But we first do the sculptures in Minnesota, and then we put them on semi trucks, and then they'd go down to wherever and then get installed. Unfortunately for me, on one of the trips, a sculpture got damaged. So my job was I was the insurance policy. So I would fly down there to make sure if anything was broke, I would be able to fix it. So anyway, but that was a great gig, and that went on for a while. And that was another example of how this kind of work, it just kind of snowballed and really kind of took off for me. And so I got known as a sculptor in the Twin Cities, and kind of the best of all gigs came when I was asked to be the characters designer and sculptor for this Marshall Fields Macy's holiday display. And it was a 6-month job. so it was great, and it was the pay was great. It wasn't like we bought Lexus or anything like that, but we were fed. We had a nice house, and I only worked 6 months a year, and that involved designing all these characters for these walkthroughs. And the characters were, the show would vary. We might have anywhere from like 45 characters to 150 characters, depending upon the show. And I did that for 20 years. So it was a good run. And so 6 months of the year, I'd work that show. And then the other 6 months of the year, I would paint as a fine artist. And that was a great experience. I got involved in quite a few galleries and quite a few. In the Twin Cities, at least there used to be a thriving independent art consultant industry there. And so a lot of people would get projects, like, for example, the Mayo Clinic, for example, may have an expansion, and they're looking for 300 paintings or something like that. And the independent art consultants were oftentimes the ones called in to do that kind of work. And again, it's like a broken record. Everything I did, it was always mostly unsolicited. I would get in on one project, and then part of what happened was in the Twin Cities here, there's been this big kind of explosion in studio buildings. There's a lot of them here, although they're starting to shrink. There aren't quite as many now as there were about 15 years ago. But there was kind of a big explosion of studio buildings, and the way they would function is they would have openings. Sometimes it's twice a year. Some studio buildings have an opening like once a month, and that got to become a thing here, and people would come and visit these studio openings, and that's how art consultants would connect with artists. And I sort of have a mixed feeling about that, because I think it really hurts galleries, this whole studio building thing. Like every idea, it can, the kernel of it can be a good idea, but when taken to an extreme, sometimes it can be a problem. And I think the gallery scene, I think, in the Twin Cities is sort of taking a hit because of that a little bit. Anyway, but it was good. In my case, it was very good. And one project would kind of lead to another, and so I've been doing that for quite a while. And eventually, what happened was Dayton's department store eventually became Marshall Fields, and then Marshall Fields was purchased by Macy's, and the whole world of department stores have really taken a hit. And so Macy's started closing stores, and eventually, oh gosh, it was probably about 10 years ago, the home store that had this auditorium finally closed down, and so the work that was in it had left. But at that point, I had enough momentum with the galleries and the art consultants that I just went ahead and put all my effort towards that for 12 months a year instead of 6 months a year. And so far I'm still standing. So it's kind of worked out. And I balance this out. I teach in addition to doing the fine art stuff. And teaching is something that I've done since I was in grad school. Even when I had no need for the cash at all, I still taught. And part of it is that I really enjoy teaching. I really get a lot out of teaching from students, and so I've always done that. So it's kind of turned into what it has. So the few things, other changes that came along besides just the commercial work leaving was changed my studio situation around. And actually, this is a very interesting story. The studio building that I was in and had been in for 20 years, became a casualty of the real estate market here in the city. So it used to be, the beauty of the city was there was always nooks and crannies and places that were a little bit overlooked. And you'd find these grungy old buildings that you could get for really cheap, rent. And for artists, you really don't need much anyway. You need heat and electricity, and that's pretty much it. And everything else we can kind of take care of ourselves. And because of that, we could find really great old buildings. Like my old building, I had an 1,800 square foot studio, almost a 2,000 square foot studio, and my rent was $600 a month. And it was like that for 20 years. And it was owned by Ed, who was this grumpy old guy who was an alcoholic, and he just got what he got, and that was it. It never got fixed up. If the building ever got fixed up, it was us artists who did it. There were 30 of us artists in it, by the way. And it was a really cool scene. And we had everything from painters to sculptors to photographers to filmmakers. We even had filmmakers there. People who worked in television. It was a great studio scene. But what happened is then about 10 years ago, I'd say the real estate market in the Twin Cities got very, very hot. And then suddenly every square inch of property in the cities became worth a lot. And so pretty much these days, anything you see is either going to be developed or has been developed or plans to be developed, and because of that, the rent's gotten really out of the stratosphere. So when I went from paying, I think it was like $3 a square foot to now, I think typically you're going to find it in the neighborhood of like $15, $20, $25 a square foot for studio space. And so 10 years ago, I kind of had enough because, a studio space is fine if you're somebody that doesn't actually need to make a living and, an expensive space, but if you're trying to make a living, cost is something you have to worry about. And so I kind of made my mind up that I was going to build a studio, and we happen to live right in the middle of the heart of the cities, Twin Cities, right between St. Paul and Minneapolis. And we have a house that's on about a lot and a half. And so then the funny part of this story is my wife is a music director for a little neighborhood church here in the cities. And everyone heard about my situation in the studio, and they decided it was going to be a Habitat for Humanity moment for them. And so I had myself and like 25 of my closest friends all decided they were going to come into my backyard and build this ginormous studio, which we did. And it's quite a story in and of itself. And pretty much everyone who helped had hardly any building experience at all. And the studio looks like it. It does not look finished and slick by any stretch of the imagination, but it's very, very functional. It works great. It was a great experience community-wise because it sort of pulled in the whole neighborhood. It wasn't just the church, but then there would be other people in the neighborhood. And so it kind of became almost like the neighborhood studio. And it's pretty big. I'll show you pictures of it, but it's pretty big. It's 900 square feet on the main floor, and then I built a half story on the second floor. So all combined, it's about 1,400 square feet now. So, and I teach classes here and do my work here, and so that's kind of what we've turned into now. My wife's a musician, and she teaches. She gives music lessons in the house, and I give painting classes in the studio, and that's about it. That's our commute. So anyway, but so that's kind of the story, and I got some visuals. I can start with some visuals, and as I go through the visuals, I'll actually make a point of actually answering that question. there were some questions. I just, holy cow, I just realized what time it is here. I gotta not talk so much. I'm going to share the screen and we'll go through some of these visuals real quick here. So, all right, well, let me just quick, just give some examples of some of the commercial work that I used to do. It's very interesting stuff. Well, let's see here. I'll show you some of the Disney stuff. This is fun. I laugh, I call these things very elaborate beer coolers because it's basically, here's what the styrofoam sculpture looks like before it's finished. This is when we were plugging Aladdin. Well, at one point, Disney had a TV show on Aladdin, so that's what this was for. There it is finished. This was, believe it or not, it was just styrofoam and then plain old everyday joint compound, sheetrock mud, and then painted. And I used the paint that is most common in theater. It's called casein paint. It's the cheapest paint on the planet. It's made from what it sounds like casein. It's like a milk glue, cheese glue, which is, and if you leave a can open, it will spoil like milk and reek like you can't believe. It's just off. We actually evacuated a department store because a cheap painter didn't want to throw a bucket away and tried to spraying a set with this stuff when it was rotten. It was pretty bad. Anyway, there's another epic gargoyle sculpture. And that's, by the way, that's the entrance to this complex. Let's see. There must be a lot of pictures of this guy. There, it gives you an idea of some of the scale. Look, my hair's dark. Let's see. Just to brag a little bit, until I came along, Disney was putting up photo cutouts. In fact, this right here in the back is a photo cutout. And I did one little sculpture for them originally, and they liked it so much, then they started hiring me for these sculptures. But before that, it was all just photo cutouts. Dalmatians, million of Dalmatians. Let's see here. There was one. Oh, here we go. This gives you an idea of the scale of this guy. That was, and there was a model, a little clay model. And I did that for all the sculptures. I would do just a little clay model first. And I learned these really cool tricks, like how to scale up a sculpture. There's a technique to that, and then it goes all the way back to ancient Egypt. There's a rig you can build that will you'll establish one point on the little model sculpture, and this rig will show you where that point is on a ginormous piece of, in my case, styrofoam. So anyway, but there he is finished. So there's an example of some of the Disney work. Then here's some of the Macy's work. These were fun because these were animatronic, and when I first came onto that project and I heard what our budget was, I was like speechless. And back in those days, they told us that, believe it or not, newspaper advertising would cost almost as much for a holiday season. And unlike a newspaper, we were pulling in anywhere from 300 to 600,000 people. So they looked at us as a good investment. And the way these figures were, now there's the mechanics to this guy. He was supposed to stand on a hillside and tap his fingers, so that's what that was for. Didn't occur to me to actually film it so you could see him moving. But actually, back in those days, it was pretty print. There's no such thing as cell phones. This was back in the Flintstone days. Now there's a clay original, and the way we made these sculptures is I would sculpt them originally in clay, and then I had a guy cast them for me, and we cast them out of a lightweight styrofoam so that all the figures would move smoothly, be as lightweight as possible. And then here's some of these figures and installations. And so much of this, the thing that was just most profound about all this production work that I did was the impact of scale. Because like in the case of the opera, when I was painting over at the Minnesota Opera, a typical backdrop there was 30 feet long and 20 feet high. So first of all, there was this amazing awareness of how scale has its own impact. You know, the size of an installation or whatever, you know, whether it's in a museum or on stage or whatever. It's just amazing. And the other thing that was a great lesson for me was when you scale up like that, your tools have to scale up. There were cases in the opera, for example, we got one designer from New York, and we did Carmen one year, and his whole set design was that the wall was going to be white, the back wall was going to be white, and that we painted the entire floor almost like an abstract, almost like a de Kooning painting. It was all bright reds and oranges and stuff. But in his little model they sent us, he had one brushstroke that went from one side of the model to the other, which looked cute and quaint. But when you scale that up to a stage, we're talking about a brushstroke that's like 25 feet long. And so we literally did it with one guy running ahead of me with a bucket and me pushing a broom. That's how we made the brushstroke. It was great. So I can say I've painted with brooms. So and so even today with painting students, they'll ask me about what they need to do for painting larger paintings. And I say, first of all, you got to do is put those little baby brushes down. You got to get yourself some big fat brushes. So anyway, more of that. This was fun to do. This was a version of Cinderella that we did. And I had fun because in this show because they really let me cut loose on facial expressions for this one. So there was a corner of my studio in production. See how weird that looked at one time. That one's always Swan Lake. This is another example of how the production work really fed into my fine artwork and how they both sort of complemented each other, is storyboarding and conceptual drawings. Before I came onto the staff, the designers basically sat around and kind of argued for a week on what they wanted, you know. And part of it was no one was actually visualizing for them some of the most crackpot ideas that they would come up with. So to finally, and when I got pulled in for the character design, I got to sit in the production meetings. And so I ended a lot of arguments by sketching out some of the better ideas and some of the more harebrained ideas. And so there's a lot of storyboarding I did. And this is like an animation storyboard or a concept drawing here. And basically I would do these sketches while the other two designers were arguing. That's basically the way that worked out. But yeah. Well, I just had to throw this guy in. It was pretty fun. It was a little mechanical guy, and I went to Joanne Fabrics and found different types of fur cloth and made this raccoon. Oh, back to him again. Oh, this gives you an idea of the scale of the entryway to the Disney booth. So Disney owned Buena Vista. So on one side of the door would be Disney, and then the other side of the door would say Buena Vista. The plantings that they rented to put in front of this alone cost $30,000. Here's an example of backdrop painting, and this is a good example of where you try to paint a backdrop so that's seamless with the staging and the set. You know, like the set. You can kind of see it up here. You can see the line right there, but the set itself starts right here, and then everything to the right is three-dimensional, and then everything to the left is a backdrop. Another example of how production work really, hugely affected me as a fine artist. I worked with a fellow in the cities who was pretty much, he was a one-man institution, in the theater world. He was a designer for the Guthrie. He designed them for Broadway for a while, and he painted backdrops in the beginning, and he was famous for being the best, fastest backdrop painter in the region. And that really means something, because like when you ask a painter, tell me about your work, they're going to say things like, oh, I'm exploring my inner child, and the tension between morality and deep thoughts, and you ask a backdrop painter, tell me about your painting, and they'll say, I did this in 2 hours. That's all they care about. They don't care about anything other than how fast did they paint this backdrop, because that's how you made your money. Was the faster you painted, the more you'd make an hour. What I learned from Jack Barker was his name. His speed and execution came from his understanding on how to use paintbrushes. And the equivalent that I can tell you, a similarity to it, is Japanese ukiyo painting, the brush painting, and for them the discussion is, how do you make this leaf in a single stroke? What's the art in how much expression can I get in a single brush stroke? And it's exactly the same thing that a really talented, well-trained backdrop painter thinks, because well, actually, I'll show you one thing. I got some of my old brushes still. I'll show you what they look like. These are relatively small and what I call surgical brushes. This is what a small surgical backdrop brush looks like. Long hair, okay? And it really does function kind of like a watercolor brush, because the scenic paint is very watery. It's kind of the consistency of milk. And the goal is to be able to literally dip this in the paint and make a single stroke from one end of the backdrop to the other end of the backdrop. Here's another kind of backdrop brush. We call these French rounds. They're also called sash brushes. This is also considered a small brush. A typical prep brush for backdrop painting is maybe, there we go, about that wide. My head's here, it's about that wide, really big. And what you learn to do with one of these brushes is, like, if you know how to use one of these things, you would be able to know how to make a line that begins very thin and then expands to something very wide and then tapers back to thin again. You can create half tones by having a light touch and then graduating into a deeper tone by adding pressure. It's amazing. And what that's done for me is it created such an awareness of the mechanics of a brush that it completely has consumed me as an oil painter. And these days, for the real hardcores, there's a lot of oil painting brushes being purchased out of a company in England called Rosemary Brushes, and they're fun. This is a Rosemary brush. And what's fun about that company is it's resurrecting a lot of old brush designs from the 19th century. This is called a long flat. And there's a lot of really cool things that these old brush designs can do that a typical, like, bright that most people think of when they think of a brush can't do. And this is all directly in response to my life as a backdrop painter and how that fed into one another. So very cool. And there's other things involved with it too. Like, for example, Jack used to talk about priming a brush with protein colloid, or priming a backdrop, priming a backdrop with what they call protein colloid, which was a type of animal glue. And in the old days, the backdrops, that's what they were primed with. And the reason they used that was because it was non-absorbent. You could make, again, a stroke that was, forever, and you could paint really quick. And it's actually a lost art form. People don't know that anymore. a lot of artists will prime a drop with starch. Starch doesn't have the starch is like painting on a sponge. But anyway, I'm in the weeds with that. But that's you can see how that affected me. Still to this day. Anyway, but that was a good example. So that's sort of how I sum up this whole conversation. Is that so? It's scale was one thing, the impact of scale. The other was how directly backdrop painting bled into fine arts painting. And the other was conceptualizing and designing was the third thing. So anyway, I've yammered enough, but already past my time. Does anybody have any questions or?
I do. This is
okay.
a very sentimental talk for me, Dan, because I'm a Minneapolis native and I grew up going to the 8th floor.
Oh, no way.
Yeah.
Really? Yeah. Oh, no.
Every year we went and we'd go to the Oak Grill for dinner. So this brought up a lot of family memories for me. And you maybe almost kind of touched on this, but, I remember of all the, we went every year. I'm remembering Beauty and the Beast, Wizard of Oz, The Grinch, Harry Potter. And I think after that, we maybe slowed down how often we were going because we were getting older. Christmas Carol. But I'm curious if there was a particular theme or story that you really connected with, or, which theme was the most fun for you to work on?
Oh, holy cow. Well, well, probably that's a tough one, as I have a whole variety of different reasons. Everything from I have this great sentimental story I have to tell you some other time. Meeting Lissy Dahl, Roald Dahl's wife. She took me out to dinner, just myself, nobody else. I thought it was going to be the whole Dayton's entourage, but it was just me. And she wanted to know all about my art training, which I thought that was kind of hilarious. But anyway, probably one of my favorite. It's kind of a toss-up between Wind in the Willows, because of a thing I had to invent. Well, in fact, you can see in the background one of my characters from Wind in the Willows. I got Badger. Let's see.
Badger, wow.
Yeah. And in fact, I'll show this real quick. Hold on. This somehow I had to figure out how to quickly put fur on 65 animals. And there's no way I was going to go out and buy fur cloth and glue on a 60. That was just going to take forever. So I invented this cool thing called a flocking machine.
Yeah.
And it's a Wimshurst generator that creates static electricity. And I attached a flour sifter to it. And then I would put loose hair in it and put glue on the animals and sift hair. And it was just like magic. It was so cool. You'd see like the hair come out of flour sifter like little arrows and stick in it. And it lasted on my Badger over 20 years. So it really worked. And I was so excited. I go, look what I invented. And everyone goes, congratulations, you invented velour. it was like no big invention, but that was fun. And then I really enjoyed doing Christmas Carol too. And that was primarily because the figures that originally used to be in the show before I came on, they shipped in from New York City from a company called Figures. And they were just god awful. One year we did when we did Beauty and the Beast. Beauty had in the corner of her mouth kind of drooped like that, and it looked like she had Bell's palsy. And it was because the mold had slipped in the casting, and they were just too lazy and piggish about fixing that. So she had this, So anyway, and all of their expressions were all the same in every scene, and that got really boring. So anyway, Christmas Carol was the first show in which they let me go crazy with facial expressions, and so I made something like 5 different facial expressions for Scrooge, and it was really fun. It was really fun to do. So everything from like being angry to, getting his life back and being ecstatic, So anyway, so.
That's great. Thanks for sharing. This was really fun for me.
Oh, good. Well, it's exciting when I run into people that actually even remember the shows anymore. It's just getting longer and longer. So.
Yeah.
You're actually probably going to be teaching here at some point in 2021, that summer, a workshop. And you mentioned that you always kept on teaching, even if you didn't necessarily need to financially. Can you tell me a little bit more about your teaching process and what you get from your students?
Oh, sure. I look at my mission as a teacher. My job is to be Peter Pan and to be communicate my fun and my excitement in making art, and that's how I measure if I'm doing things right. Is how excited everybody else gets. So I usually like to demo. I do a lot of demoing, so because I figure that's the best way to get people going, and do lots of that. And I always get things back from students too. They have their own level of excitement. So, but usually I like to demo. I'm a real art history fanatic and love to talk about the origin of things and the history of things, and so that's always part of how I approach teaching too. So, then the other thing is when students are doing work in the studio. One of the big messages I like to try to get across is for me anyway, learning has always been about quantity, not quality. In other words, you'll get more, and it's a more enjoyable thing if you remind yourself that your job is not to make a thing that's perfect. Your job is to develop, take on this activity that is fun and engaging and rewarding. And sometimes that means that if you're working on a painting that just isn't going very well and you kind of don't like it anymore, it's okay to stop and not finish it and go to something else. So actually, John Sargent, who everyone loves again these days, he's back to being popular. Actually would practice starting paintings, which I think is really fascinating. He would practice beginning a painting with no intent of finishing it, just because he wanted to learn something about how to start a painting. And I always try to tell students that, painting or drawing or anything, it should be thought of more almost like a performing art rather than a studio art, in the sense that like a good example is a performing artist. They can practice on Tuesday and be brilliant, and then on Thursday be brilliant, and Wednesday be brilliant, and then they have to perform. And for whatever reason, they stubbed their toe on the stage, or they ate the wrong breakfast, or whatever. They suck that night, but they have to live with whatever they did. And I think that's a good message for people, whether it's student painter or somebody who's a professional, is you learn that it's being in the moment, and you are whatever you are at that particular situation. And I know I'm getting very lost in the weeds again, but yeah. But that's kind of my philosophy about learning painting or drawing or pastel. So
thank you.
Anyway.
I have one other Minnesotan native sentimental question, and that's your bio mentions that you did something for Prince. I'm curious what that project
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I have bragging rights that I worked on the worst movie ever made by mankind. And it wasn't Purple Rain. And the fact that you would not know probably what the second movie was, that he ever tells you how bad it was.
Yeah, that's the only one I know.
I know. Well, he did a very little known movie afterwards called Graffiti Bridge, and it was I went to the screening after I worked on it, and it was just the worst ever. He tried. Well, it was pretty funny actually. It was again, it was a really cool experience. I got called. They wanted a sculptor, and it was pretty funny because it was a little bit overkill. Uh, they hired a sculptor just to sculpt boulders, which I think anyone could probably sculpt anyway. That's what I got hired for, was to sculpt styrofoam boulders.
Oh. Not as glamorous as I was expecting.
No. But I did get to meet him, and I did get to set in Paisley Park and watch shoot. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah.
So